This morning, I'm just sat at the front of our house and looking out of the window while I'm thinking about what I want to do in this podcast. Well, I've sort of got an idea anyway. And I'm looking through, we've got this beautiful tree. It's a cherry tree. It's absolutely enormous. But you can see the sunshine on the leaves and the foliage. And then as you look through, we look to a park, which is absolutely beautiful. We're so blessed where we are. Anyway, so to get to the business of the podcast, yesterday I was talking to my foreign students because each week I have a 2-hour Zoom lesson with my foreign students, and I asked them for a subject, and whatever subject, because quite often in the interlude we start going off on all different tangents, which is ever so easy for me to do. I'm terrible at that, but still. So they were talking about apparitions. And I thought, yeah, okay, that's a good one. And it turned into a fascinating 2 hours, in fact, more than 2 hours. And we want to continue it in our next session next week. But we were talking about asking, each and every one of us, have you ever seen someone who actually wasn't there? And or maybe felt someone that wasn't actually there? And I think that's quite a question to begin with. And I find it fascinating, always have, because as you know, I'm a transphysical medium. I sit in seance and I have actually had experiences. But obviously, this podcast is all about you and what your opinions are. So I don't sort of necessarily mean a ghost when I ask, have you felt someone there who wasn't actually there? But I sort of want you to think about talking about something perhaps much more subtle. And I'm sure a lot of you have seen something and were absolutely convinced you had seen something. And you wake in the night perhaps, and then just for a moment there's someone standing in the room. Or maybe, you felt someone sitting on the bed. Or you catch sight of someone out of the corner of your eye. And again, that is something I talk an awful lot about with my students, because when you are sensing energy or sensing something that, shall we say, is of a non-physical experience, usually you do see it from the corner of your eye. And the problem is, if you turn around and look, then you lose it. But if you just allow whatever it is to unfold, then you can pick up an awful lot of information. Or you might even be perhaps walking into a familiar place. It could be your house. We live in a lovely tall Victorian house, and it certainly has an awful lot of energy, and we've caught all sorts of things on our infrared cameras, which we have throughout the house. So it could be in your home, or it could be a familiar place, like maybe you work in a hospital and you've experienced things. Maybe you are working with those of us who are dying, and you've had that wonderful, wonderful, honourable experience of being with them through their last moments of life on this earth. But of course, life continues as far as I'm concerned. But when you have this sort of thing, I think there's all of a sudden this overwhelming feeling that you're not alone. Or maybe perhaps, after someone you love has died, you could swear that you saw them. Not dreamed about them, but actually saw them. And I know that, obviously with my own experience with those that have passed that I love, and also my fur babies, my cats that have passed, I'm very much aware of them in our house. And it's not a dream. It's not that I'm remembering them. It's just something out of the blue. I might be popping upstairs to the top floor just to get something and, not thinking of anything. And then something will pop in and I will be aware of something. I've been reading a book this week as well, which I was talking to the students about, called Alchemy and Mysticism by Alexander Roob, and a section in there on apparitions. And it sent me down one of those rabbit holes that I absolutely love, because apparitions have been appearing, if you'll forgive the phrase, throughout human history. It goes way, 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 way back, and most of us know that. And they usually turn up in like religious garb, so it could be a nun or a monk or a bishop or whatever. But usually, the biggest amount of people who see things would say that it was of religious tradition, or it could be, sort of a mystical something, or folklore, or art, or counts from completely ordinary people. But people have seen apparitions appearing. And like I say, it goes way, way back. It's not something that's new at all. And sometimes they're described as spirits, sometimes they say they're angels, sometimes they'd say that they're their loved ones who they've lost. And sometimes they can be these mysterious figures who don't really seem to sort of belong anywhere at all. Or it could be, this is what I hear an awful lot from my students over the decades of talking about this, is people may see, sort of like a sort of a column of light in a particular colour. And that has an energy to it, a very loving, powerful energy to it. And occasionally people report seeing perhaps someone that they didn't even know had died. And that's happened a few times, with clients. And then they got ever so worried, rang up, and of course they found that they had passed. So what on earth's going on? And I'm saying what on earth because, this is us seeing it on our 3D Earth, isn't it? Or perhaps the question is, does it have anything to do with Earth at all? So I'm obviously not going to ask you to answer that straight away. I'd like you to listen further to what I have to say. And I'm certainly not going to answer that for you because you know me. I'd much rather open a few doors and then just let you decide which, if any, you want to walk through. And I think that's the best way when you look at anything like this. It's got to be your own truth, hasn't it? If people tell you something and there's no evidence behind it, then, yes, you can believe it as a story. But if it's really interesting to you, it's got to resonate with you. So what exactly is an apparition? And of course, the students were coming out with all sorts of stuff yesterday. And most of them were saying immediately, oh, it's a ghost, or it's a spirit. But historically, the idea is much broader. An apparition is essentially an appearance, something that's presenting itself to our perception. And within mystical traditions, appearances weren't necessarily treated as entertainment, nor were they seen as frightening or supernatural. They were very natural events. And they could hold significant and symbolic messages. So, say, for instance, if you went back to the Celts or the Druids and they were wanting to, is it the right time to harvest or whatever it is, they may get something that they would believe would come to them that would be of a nature energy, perhaps like the Green Man or something like that. And they would take that and translate that information they were given. But a vision might represent, something happening within the individual as much as happening outside of them. And of course, my field is psychology and metaphysical therapies, and I'm interested in the human energy field. I'm also a life coach. So of course, there may be something that's happening internally in a person that is something that's happening inside of them. And this is where my reading about alchemy again becomes particularly interesting, because alchemy wasn't simply about people in dark rooms trying to turn lumps of metal into gold, where you often think it's that, that they were able to transform things. Its imagery is actually filled with transformation, but it's connected with perhaps light to darkness or death to rebirth, the visible to invisible, material to spiritual, the known and the unknown. So when we encounter strange figures, visions, and extraordinary beings that we can't quite make out what they are, in the old mystical illustrations, perhaps we shouldn't immediately ask, did someone literally see this? Because those visions that they wrote down or they drew or they painted or whatever could be something that they were symbolically trying to show you from what they felt they had perceived. So what were they trying to show us? And then, of course, there's a possibility that sometimes people really did believe that they'd seen something. Now, I'm not sitting on the fence because I have actually seen things, but and I've done podcasts about that as well, which if you look back, you'll be able to hear my experiences. But I want you to, I'm sure a lot of you have had experiences of your own, but if you haven't, then just have an open mind. Now, one area that I find really fascinating, because I lived in Sicily, and they were ever so superstitious. Oh my goodness, they were. And they still are, of course. And they often talk about seeing the dead. So, and I think it's particularly fascinating because there's a number of people who report sensing or seeing someone after that person has died. And these experiences aren't confined to people who would describe themselves as spiritual. So it could be your mum or your dad who would never believe in ghosts or go to church or think of anything in that way. But when they passed, that person saw them. And they really did feel they were either sensing or seeing that person. Now, researchers have studied what are sometimes called sensed presence experiences in bereavement. This is psychology. And people may hear a familiar voice or feel someone beside them, briefly see them, or maybe just simply know with an extraordinary certainty that that person is really there. And interestingly, the researchers found that these experiences occur across all sorts of different cultures. I spoke about Sicily, but Sicily is particularly superstitious in lots of different ways. But, it can be all cultures, from very Western minded people to, very spiritually minded people, in the Far East, the extremes. And there's something else I think is important. For many people, the experience isn't frightening. Oh, it can be so deeply comforting. Deeply, deeply comforting. I remember when I lost recently my dear, dear cat, Jess, and I saw him on the stairs. And I was just in floods of tears and everything else. But the wonderful thing was we caught it on camera as well, on the infrared camera, because we have them in the hallways and we've got big stairwells. And I just sat on the stairs and just, spoke to him, and I was just so comforted that I was aware that he was okay. And, of course, I know that, but when it's somebody you love or something that you love, a pet or whatever, sometimes that goes out of the window. What you know is happening. I know that life continues, but it's hard, isn't it, when you lose something that you really, really love? And researchers studying bereavement have even explored whether, these experiences can become part of the continuing bond that we have with someone who's died or with an animal that's died, and how people incorporate them into their understanding of life and loss. And that was a big, I remember reading this quite some time ago from Roehampton University. They did, quite a big thesis on that, and it was really interesting. Now, of course, Does that mean the deceased person actually visited them? I've got to sit on the fence in this podcast, even though I'm biased, but I'm going to sit on the fence and say we don't know. Could the mind, dealing with grief and an enormous change in its understanding of reality, create an extraordinary, convincing experience of that person or that animal? Well, possibly. But then I find myself asking another question. If the experience feels completely real to the person having it, where do we actually draw the line? The line between something created within our consciousness or something perceived outside of it. And I think that's a great question, actually. And I suppose that's another lovely rabbit hole that we can go down. Anyway, I like to look at the science as well. And I was talking, obviously, to the students about the science side. And science gives us another fascinating way of looking at this. Our brains don't simply record reality like video cameras. They're constantly interpreting it. And what happens when the brain interprets, it will decide upon whether you're in a good place or a bad place, whether you're in a spooky place or a loving place, whether you're in a scared place or you're absolutely in a fantastic, calm, peaceful place. And what it does is it fills the gaps. And then it can predict, it can start predicting, comparing what's happened now with everything that we've experienced before. And scientists actually have been able to produce, a sensation of another presence experimentally by disrupting the normal relationship between movement and sensory feedback. For instance, if you think about that, I have actually an ozone machine that I use in my clinic. And when you sent the ozone, sort of into the room, which I do quite often, it can have that sort of make the hair on your arms prickle up. That sensation where you think, "Oh, what's that?" And also, if you're in an old house, we're in an old house, and some of our floors are not straight. And if you're walking in a straight line, looking forward, and the floor beneath you is going at a slant or, it's at an angle, you could feel ever so disorientated. And you get a different, the relationship that I was saying before between movement and sensory feedback changes. In other words, under certain circumstances, the brain can apparently generate the extraordinary feeling that someone else is nearby. And that's why I think a lot of really old, I've been in some amazing houses. We used to live in a medieval house in France, and none of the floors were straight. None of the walls were straight, obviously. It was absolutely, you were walking, going off to the side like you're walking like a crab sometimes. But it had an amazing effect on people when they came in. Anyway, I think that's fascinating. But again, notice what that tells us and what it doesn't. It tells us that the brain is capable of creating a sense of presence. It doesn't, though, automatically prove that every reported apparition throughout history was created that way. And I think sometimes we make that leap too quickly. You can be skeptical, and I think skepticism is really, really good when you're looking at this sort of thing. But, you can't sort of bundle them all into one filing system. So on both sides, one person says the brain can produce this experience, therefore ghosts don't exist. And another says, I saw my grandma at the end of my bed. Therefore, I've proved life after death. So have we really proved either? Probably not. And actually, I think the mystery is much more interesting when we resist the temptation to close it down. Now, the other thing is, why do apparitions often look like human beings? Here's something else to think about. Why a person? Why a nun? Why a priest? Why do so many accounts involve a human figure? Perhaps our brains are extraordinarily tuned to recognize other human beings. And I must admit, if you're in sort of lying in bed at night time, it's ever so dark, it might be raining, the wind might be howling outside, and you've got your dressing gown stuck on a little hook on the back of your door, and you just briefly look round, you can straight away think that that's a person standing there. I mean, how many of us have done that? Because our brain are more or less tuned. Our brain likes patterns, and it likes to recognize things, make sense of things. And the other thing is we can see faces in clouds, can't we? And if you look at the bark on a tree, you might see an animal or a face or something. A lot of people see, sort of faces in wallpaper and even on pieces of toast. And we make, our brain says, oh yes, that's the shape of a human, or that's a face, or that's a dog, that's a cat, that's a mouse, whatever it is. So perhaps when we're presented with ambiguous visual information, the mind constructs the most socially important thing it knows, another person. But mystics might turn that completely round. Perhaps consciousness is capable of perceiving things that an ordinary senses normally filter out. And we have what we call object permanence and object non-permanence. And the object permanence is what when we've got our eyes open and what have you, and we look in the room and we see a wardrobe, that's always going to be a wardrobe. But if we go to sleep and we dream about the wardrobe, that's object non-permanence, as it's not actually physically in front of us. So we've got these two capacities to perceive. So perhaps the apparition isn't being constructed. Perhaps for a few seconds, the filter has just changed. I can't prove that. And neither, as far as I'm concerned, should we pretend we can. But it's a rather beautiful possibility to contemplate. Then we have what we were talking about with the students, and that is crisis apparitions. And I think they're the strangest categories of all. And that's when there are loads of stories that have long existed of people apparently seeing or even sensing somebody at or around the time that that person dies. And sometimes before the observer knows anything has happened. And these are often called crisis apparitions. And they're particularly intriguing because I think grief alone can't easily be offered as an explanation if the person experiencing it doesn't yet know that there's anything to grieve about. And of course, we have to be careful. Memory is unreliable, coincidences happen, and stories change in the telling. And once we know someone has died, our memory of something unusually earlier that day can suddenly acquire enormous significance. All perfectly reasonable explanations, but every so often you encounter an account that makes you stop and think, that's odd. And I like that's odd. I think that's odd is one of the healthiest phrases we can have when exploring these subjects. Because when you say that's odd, it doesn't mean to say that you believe it, or it doesn't mean to say that you don't believe it, or that you're going to dismiss it. It just means that you're interested, doesn't it? And perhaps that's the point. The more I read about alchemy, mysticism, and the strange experiences human beings have reported for centuries, the less interested I become in finding one definitive answer. And perhaps that's not what these subjects are asking from us. Alchemy itself is filled with transformation, taking something apparently ordinary and discovering something extraordinary within it. And perhaps apparitions invite us to do something similar, to look again at perception, at consciousness, to look at death, to look at memory, to look at what we call reality. And maybe an apparition is a spirit, or maybe it's a mind, or maybe it's simply grief. Or maybe it's a momentary neurological event. Maybe it's a symbolic experience rising from somewhere deep within us. But we don't know. Maybe consciousness is stranger and larger than we currently understand, and perhaps different experiences have completely different explanations. I rather like that possibility too, because we don't have to put every mystery into the same box, do we? So, I'm going to leave you with a question. I like my questions. If you saw somebody standing at the end of your bed tonight, somebody you knew couldn't possibly be there, what would convince you that you'd really seen them? And perhaps even more interestingly, what would convince you that you hadn't? So, I'll leave you with that one, because sometimes the most interesting place isn't belief or disbelief. It's that wonderful little space in between where we can simply say, do you know what? I don't know. All I do know is that it's fascinating and I'm really curious about it. Before I go, if you'd like me to look at your numbers, I do offer personal numerology readings. To do a proper reading, I need your full date of birth, your exact time of birth, and the place you were born. Those 3 pieces of information allow me to build a much more complete picture, combining numerology and to create a reading that's unique to you. People often come to me when they're at a crossroads, when life feels as though it's changing, or when they simply want to understand themselves on a deeper level. It's amazing how much can be revealed. Your reading is recorded personally by me as a private audio message, so you can listen to it whenever you like and revisit it as often as you need. If that feels like something you're being drawn towards, you'll find all the details in the show notes. I'd love to read your numbers, so until next time, take care and I'll see you in the next episode.